All right. It looks like we might have everyone in here. So welcome everyone and thank you for coming. My name is Dustan DiIorio. I'm the Associate Director of Programs and Survivor Services here at Wings. Thank you again for coming today. I have a few notes that I want to go over before we get started with the actual session discussion. As you can already probably tell, people of all genders are welcome and may be in this session. We are recording this session so that it can be viewed throughout the month for anyone who registers after today. This won't reveal anyone's identity in the webinar format that we're using today, since everyone's screens are off and everyone is muted. Please feel free to use the chat to talk to one another or to talk to us throughout the session. If you're comfortable, please go ahead and enter your name and where you're joining us from right now in the chat. And also make sure that you're choosing the all panelists and attendees, as sometimes it defaults to just panelists. I would also say about the chat that please feel free to add your thoughts on any topic that Jean and I are discussing throughout this session so that we can give more voice and have more depth to our discussion. If you'd like to submit specific questions for us to answer throughout this session, please do so in the Q&A function on your screen, and we'll do our best to answer those both while we're talking, and we'll leave a little time to go over questions as well. If you need any support with technical features, please send a question to Julia, who you'll find in the chat as an option. And I think she'll also introduce herself in there to all of you. We're honored and grateful that you're choosing to participate in our 2020 Race for Healing, where our theme for the event of learning and holistic healing is It's About Time. We've chosen that theme for a few reasons. First, we believe as a culture, it's about time that we recognize the needs of adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse, because this issue affects so many people in our culture. And what we've seen, that's about 1 in 5 adults. And let's just be frank, more can be done and needs to be done, and we want to play a role in making that happen. Second, we want to overcome the silence and denial affecting survivors in this issue. It will take all of us dedicating our most precious resource, which is our time, to learning about, speaking about, and supporting the healing of CSA survivors. That's why we encourage you to track your minutes through our online race platform this year. The more time we all spend supporting survivors in these issues, the more time survivors can regain in building healthy and thriving lives. Third, we know that during this difficult year of physical distancing, all of us may be experiencing extra stress in our lives, and this can be hard for those directly impacted by CSA trauma specifically, as well as those not directly impacted by CSA. The good news is that the types of holistic healing activities that support, soothe, and strengthen healing and resilience during trauma recovery are actually beneficial to all of us, even those who haven't experienced CSA trauma. That is why we've created these virtual sessions to focus on aspects of holistic healing that, again, follow that theme of It's About Time. Because healing is about the time we dedicate to many of these foundational practices. And if you missed any previous session this month, we invite you to view those replays on our Race for Healing activity sign-up page. So we are posting all of those as we go. So today, I'd like to welcome you to our 5th virtual event in this series called It's About Healing. Whether you are a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, the loved one of a survivor, a healing professional, or a new friend or ally of this cause, we thank you for tuning in to this presentation, and we hope that you will get a lot out of this wonderful content that Jean and I have prepared. Okay, so that being said, let's jump into this. I want to first give a moment to introduce my partner today, and that's Jean. So Jean, do you want to take a moment to tell everyone a little bit about yourself?
Absolutely. Currently, I'm working with Wings as the lead consultant on a systems change project that's funded by the Attorney General's office in Colorado that's designed to improve the quality of and access to services for adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse throughout the state. So I'm really excited about that work. I think that's powerful work that's going to be really helpful to survivors, because we know it can be difficult for survivors to access all of the services they need for their healing journey, particularly in some locations. And just so you get a sense of how I was drawn into doing this work, I started my career in child protection. I worked for probably over 10 years as a trauma psychotherapist in a specialized treatment program at West Pines Lutheran Medical Center called the Assault Survivors Assistance Program. And I worked with a large number of adult survivors in that program. I was also the executive director of the Colorado Coalition Against Sexual Assault and the first full-time dedicated staff person to Colorado's Sex Offender Management Board. So I have a kind of a broad background in this particular issue. And I currently have my own business and I do training, consulting, and expert testimony related to child sexual abuse and sexual assault and domestic violence and trauma. So you kind of have a sense about all the different ways I might be connected with this work. And I really feel privileged to be working with Wings currently on improving services for adult survivors, because that's been a commitment throughout my adult career.
Thank you so much, Jean. I want to say personally, I find it to be a privilege to be able to work with Jean on a regular basis and be able to do this presentation today with Jean, because Jean has is a great resource for information on this topic and has done so much for this community. So thank you so much for being here, Jean, with us today.
Right back at you, Dustin. You're an amazing resource as well.
Thank you. So I will also be talking through this session with Jean as well. So as I mentioned, I'm the associate director at Wings, but I am an LPC and have worked in the trauma space for many years now, mostly working with transitional age youth, so youth going into adulthood, many of which who have lost their families in the process of the traumas and other things that they'd experienced, been very institutionalized. So that's a huge portion of my background. I have experience also in doing crisis work and evaluating people who are experiencing psychological distress. And then I've actually gone heavily into training as well and trying to, in a lot of ways that Jean's talking about, really trying to educate the community and providers on how we can best approach working with them. So we're both really excited to be here today. And we hope that this information will be helpful for many of you. So that being said, I would like to start by centering us in this moment that we're here. We have a lot of information to go through, so I'm going to start with just a quote, a reflective quote. So here it is. My happiness grows in direct proportion to my acceptance and in inverse proportion my expectations. I just wanted to give a moment to just let that sink in and what we're talking about. We know that today's topic may feel heavy to many watching. We're going to discuss both general impacts of childhood sexual abuse trauma and healing. So no matter where you are in your healing journey, we want to encourage you to hold acceptance for yourself and your experience through this discussion. You may find that you agree or connect with some of the things that we say, but maybe not all. And that's okay. Trauma affects all of us in different ways. And we hope that what we provide to you today is a foundation for more exploration and healing. We want to remind everyone that although this content will hopefully be informative, it is potentially triggering information for some. So please take a moment to think about what you will need if you become triggered, and make sure that you have a plan for stepping away to care for yourself if things become too intense during this. We are providing access to some support resources in the chat if you do feel overwhelmed. So Julia should be posting those shortly for you. If things do get difficult, maybe, for example, you might just need to take a walk for a moment and then come back. Maybe you would want to just do some breathing or mindfulness while you're watching. Or maybe you even want to leave completely to go call a friend or just take some space. Please take any of those steps that you need to care for yourself. And remember that this is being recorded and will be available in the future. So there really is no rush to get through it. Take your time and please pay attention to what you need as we go. So at this point, I'd like to hand it over to Jean to start the bulk of our discussion today.
Okay, thanks, Dustin. I'm wanting to introduce this with an image that we're going to share with you all to start. And if you want to keep the ASL interpreter on your screen while you're sharing, while we're sharing our screen, but you're not seeing both us and the interpreter when the screen share begins, here's what you need to do. At the top of your screen, you'll see a selection called View Options. Click on that, and you should see an option called Side by Side. Select it to make sure that it is checked. If this doesn't bring both Dustin, me, and the interpreter into your screen, then please send a message to Julia in the chat and label it tech support. She'll be able to help you figure that out. So as we share this image, what we are sharing is a visual that was developed by a research group that came from the University of Colorado School of Public Health that partnered with Wings Foundation to do some research on the needs and whether those needs were being met of adult survivors and loved ones throughout Colorado. And one of the things that they were profoundly impacted by was that something in childhood is so foundational that it can bring up many issues throughout the lifespan. And one of the things I want to really acknowledge is child sex abuse trauma is traumatic, whether or not there's additional violence present, whether or not the offender did positive grooming and the child wasn't terrified during the sexual abuse. It is absolutely considered trauma by everybody who works in this field and all the researchers who've done research. We know that it has effects that can not only impact us at the time we're children, but all of the aspects of our lives, from the time it happens throughout adulthood and into the future even. And it's really important that what we understand is while these impacts can impact us body, mind, and spirit and can be long-term, we can also address and heal these things. What is really difficult is when we live with these effects without the proper support and connection with others. We often continue to interact with the world as if we're still in danger of being traumatized or still living in a world that's filled with sexual abuse and we're still children. So that's one of the things that we often look at is how we begin to feel pretty much at risk all the time, almost as if we're acting out of a survival mode when we are, when we've experienced sexual abuse.
Wow, thank you, Jean. That was really interesting. And I know we're really, I know I'm interested in talking about and getting to recovery, but can we spend a few moments to talk about some of the effects of CSA?
Absolutely. What we often see are a sort of a pattern of general effects that many people experience. What I want to say though is experiences of sexual abuse can vary greatly from a single incident by a stranger, which is pretty rare, to long-term abuse by someone a child knows and cares about well, or abuse by multiple offenders. And that means the effects of that experience can vary just as much. So we want to acknowledge that everybody experiences sexual abuse somewhat differently, and the effects will be individual for each person, depending on their experience, the level of support they have in the world, their sort of inherent coping skills, their age and developmental capacity at the time that it happened, and that all of those things impact how someone may experience it and how it may impact them over time. What we're going to be talking about today are some common patterns that we see in many survivors of adult childhood sexual abuse. And as Dustin said earlier, some of this may fit for you and some of it may not fit for you. And that's absolutely okay. This is really something that we're trying to share as much information as we can so it's useful for everyone. And one of the first of those patterns that we see are that people begin to engage in survival-based behaviors, behaviors that act as if the world around oneself is frightening or terrifying or potentially harmful or can hurt us. And so those are often attempts to take care of ourselves. And they often originate when the sexual abuse is happening and the trauma is happening. However, if they're not addressed over time, they can continue to happen. While those behaviors are incredibly protective about the actual trauma, they help us get through without going crazy. They help us survive things that are far beyond our developmental capacity and sometimes violent or really frightening to us. They're also not useful when in the here and now there aren't violent or dangerous things happening. So that's why it's important that we look at healing from this so that we know how to choose when to operate in survival mode and when not to, rather than operating that way as sort of a normal approach to the world. Another thing that I think is really important is that sexual abuse, childhood sexual abuse, can impact all aspects of us, mind, body, and spirit. And we'll talk about some of those impacts as we go through the day today. And that all of these responses really are normal responses to the trauma of childhood sexual abuse. And a reminder that childhood sexual abuse is almost always a betrayal by a trusted adult or older sibling or older child who the child knows, who engages with them in some way that's beyond their developmental capacity and that is inappropriate to the role of someone who should be able to care for and protect that child. So that's why it's traumatic, regardless of whether there is like a big single violent incident of childhood sexual abuse. And it can be traumatic even if it's someone a child loves and cares about and wants to stay connected to. And that's really important for all of us to understand. The other thing is that children often sort of normalize what happens to them and how they feel and experience the world as a normal part of growing up, because if it happens in the home or at school or at church and it happens repetitively and it's with people you care about and nobody addresses it, it feels like it's a normal part of growing up. So children begin to think that that's just how they're supposed to behave and feel in the world. And sometimes as they get older and realize not everyone has those experiences, they begin to feel shame about those experiences and they can really complicate matters by blaming themselves and thinking it happened because something was wrong with them, rather than recognizing that the responsibility for all of it rested with the person who chose to abuse them. So one of the first things I talked about is mind, body, and spirit, that sort of triad. And we're going to focus on the impacts that happen in the mind component of that triad first.
Hey, Jean.
And, yes.
Before you move on to that, we had someone that asked if we could put the image back up again. So would you mind if we do that for a moment?
Not at all.
Great, thank you so much. Feel free to keep going. I just didn't want to mess you up by putting that back up there.
Oh no, that's totally fine. I can do that. So I'm going to go back now and talk about impacts on mind. And when we're talking about mind, we're thinking about how it impacts our thoughts, our emotional responses, and our belief systems about the world. And I'm going to talk for a moment about how it impacts our thoughts. And one of the things that typically happens when someone's sexually abused and it's not addressed and they don't experience recovery in childhood, so for adult survivors, is that this can lead to something that we call cognitive distortions. They're thoughts that are based in the reality of the sexual abuse with the misunderstandings that a child might apply to that experience when they've not been rescued and supported in recovery in childhood. So they're not things that kids make up because they're crazy. They're things that are a result of the disordered experience that they live being sexually abused and not having that adequately addressed while they're growing up. One of those kinds of cognitive distortions is that sort of extreme thinking where we perceive things around us as good or bad, safe or dangerous, all or nothing. And it can be very difficult to see layers of gray or neutral in the world, or to see that so many things have dualities. Someone we don't like might do good things in the world. Someone we care about deeply might make really bad decisions. And those things can be real. It's actually more common in the adult world that many of the things we experience are more complicated than right or wrong, all or nothing. And certainly there are things that we would all say, child sexual abuse is wrong, period. We don't support that anywhere. But there are many other things that people do, how they communicate, how they deal with conflict, whether they're effective in their work, whether they're really good parents or just good enough parents. All of those things are things that are more complicated and have more duality than right or wrong. And so what can happen when you start to feel that way is you may feel incredibly isolated. You may feel like the world is a dangerous place. You may feel incredibly lonely. Or you may miss danger signals because you care about someone and you're used to people who care about you doing things that hurt you. So we can end up being victimized in adulthood, or we can end up having intimate partner violence or sexual violence occur and not understand what happened. And sometimes that increases self-blame because it just seems to reinforce for people that there's something wrong with them when it is absolutely not. And there's another one that is really related to that self-blame, where we interpret the experience that we've had in the world related to sexual abuse as if it was a choice or capacity that we had. And one of the things that's most powerful for me always is to think about the relationship between a teacher and a student, a father or a mother and a child, a priest and a child parishioner, a coach and someone on their team, and really think about, look at the difference in power, look at the difference in capacity, look at the difference in ability to act of their own volition, and look who's more likely to be literally trained and educated to do what they're told and comply with those requests from adults and older kids in their lives. So it really is a distortion when we blame ourselves, but it's one that's very common among people who experience childhood sexual abuse. And Dustin, I introduced this idea of self-blame. Can you tell us more about how trauma impacts our emotional response to things?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that, Jean. As you mentioned, right, this is all very complicated. So we see that as well with emotions, that there's a increase in intensity, but also this feeling of emotions being more complicated, harder to understand as well. So specific emotions that we notice a lot as being more increased or more complicated in nature when you experience CSA trauma are shame, guilt, and feelings of hopelessness. Many survivors, right, being at a young age when this happened, when the abuse happens, are left with questions and emotions after the experience of abuse as to whether or not it was their fault, as Jean was talking about. This can generally be made worse when we consider that abusers and sometimes even family members may directly or indirectly reinforce those beliefs. Right? So I feel it's my fault when other people tell me that I shouldn't have done X, Y, or Z, then that reinforces that it was indeed my fault. Right? So many survivors over time internalize this messaging and begin experiencing shame for actions that are not even their own or that they could not control. Right? These unresolved feelings of shame cause many survivors to feel paralyzed or maybe wrong in their convictions or powerless in their interactions with others. Right? And like we said, that's a feeling comes about from the reality of what happened. It is not the reality, right, that you are powerless, right, or that it was. The emotions that trauma creates can be different in all of us, for sure. I think the important thing that we want to remind everyone of is the importance of starting to view your emotions as a sign or a signal of something that's going on inside your body, mind, and spirit. Not all emotions are telling us that something is wrong with the world, right, or that we're in danger. Sometimes our emotions are simply a sign of something else that's going on for us. So remember that emotions themselves cannot harm us, but they can change how we think and how we view the world around us in any given moment. Often when we experience the most negative, self-damaging thoughts, those thoughts are directly connected to emotions like shame, guilt, and hopelessness. Many times we may try to help ourselves by addressing the thoughts, right? Problem solving, trying to fix a problem that we are experiencing internally. But oftentimes what we discover is that when we address our emotions and how we feel, the thoughts change. The thoughts become more positive. The thoughts feel more manageable or controllable, right? As opposed to, I need to solve this problem and then I will feel better. And that's a really interesting and important distinction that I think can be hard at times to really see or even understand until you feel it and try to practice it. So I think that's the most important thing we want to make known about emotions at this time. But I will say that when we discuss the body, we are going to come back and talk about emotional regulation and the impact that CSA trauma does have on emotional regulation, which is very connected to this. So from there, I kind of mentioned, and you'll notice this probably from G and I's, we really see all of these things as connected. All of these impacts are caused by the same thing and cause each other and impact and build on each other. So when I talk about emotions, I'm already mentioning things like belief systems or worldviews, right? So you may have a different way that you view that. We could really even be talking about your individual culture, the things that you believe because of how you've been brought up and what you've experienced. But we see these belief systems also being significantly impacted with trauma. And it has an impact on the emotions that we just talked about, right? So I did mention the tendency to internalize blame, and so did Jean. This is an example of how our belief systems can change with trauma. When you are a child, you learn by watching others and determining the rules of the world based on how others around you act. If you are abused by those people, it can be very difficult to learn healthy, accurate rules about the world. People who have experienced trauma may hold beliefs that all people will hurt them, that they cannot be successful, or even that they are meant to be sexual objects for other people. Many of these beliefs form unconsciously, and it may take many years for many of us to recognize when we are holding damaging beliefs about ourselves or the world. In many ways, the beliefs that survivors internalize from abuse become the handcuffs that keep all of us feeling trapped and hopeless long into adulthood. The belief systems is the way, and in many ways you can describe as the way that an abuser sticks with you long term and affects the decisions that you make every day. What I want to offer here is that if you feel comfortable, we would love to hear in the chat maybe other examples of beliefs that can change with trauma. Maybe they're ones that you've experienced personally. Maybe you just have thoughts that this could be something, or you've seen it in other people. But if you feel comfortable or have a thought on that, please feel free to add it to the discussion in the chat. I'll give a moment just for people to think through that in case there is a need to respond.
Dustin, I have an example while we're giving people a moment if they want to add. And someone identified being unlovable as one of those thoughts. I think that's very common. World unsafe, feeling unworthy about everything, and that our needs don't matter. That's powerful. Oh, and this one is not uncommon. I'm responsible for the happiness of others. It's my job to take care of others' feelings. And then some people identified living in fear. Those are all distortions that result from a real experience in childhood, but that don't need to apply to us in adulthood in the same way. And there's another one here that says it will always be this way, and that they walk on eggshells or that they don't matter. Very powerful messages that can have a huge impact on our lives.
And to think about how long many of us have carried these beliefs without realizing where they came from or that they were even inside of us. And that they're different maybe than what other people who haven't experienced trauma are thinking.
Right. And even the idea that someone could be too wounded to heal to the level they thought they could. And that's a distorted message as well, but it is so common that people feel that way, or that everything bad that happens in the world is their fault. That they're incredibly powerful in terms of creating bad effects. And again, that's something that's clearly not accurate, but often something children who've been sexually abused learn. And it was my fault that you, as a child who didn't even know about sex, did something that caused someone to sexually abuse you, which is not possible. Because even if a child were acting out sexually, a healthy adult would make the child safe and talk about what behaviors we do in public, what behaviors we do in private, and what behaviors we don't do because they could hurt somebody. So even if a child were doing something that was overtly sexual because they're exploring their own sexuality, that's not the child's fault either.
It's just, you can feel the weight of these statements as people are putting them up, the responsibility and the weight of it all, and holding that for your whole life. It's just it's hard to grapple with the impact that really has. Well, thank you everyone for putting your thoughts in the chat, and please continue to do so. They're very powerful messages. But I will kind of push things over to you, Jean, in terms of moving on to talk about the body. Can you tell us a little bit more about how the trauma impacts the body specifically?
Absolutely. So this part of the discussion is going to be about emotional regulation, about trauma responses, stress chemicals, and the way that impacts us in terms of sometimes feeling disembodied or not connected to our body, and how it can impact us sexually, because all of those things can be impacted by trauma. At a biological level, the experience of trauma is perceived by our brains as a threat. And we typically, the first response to threat is that our brains flood our bodies with stress chemicals. And that does a couple of things. One is it makes us a little bit stronger, our vision a little bit better, our our response time a little shorter, because the brain, the primitive brain that reacts, doesn't distinguish between something that is a violent attack by a predator or somebody with a gun, or somebody being sexual with the child who's not developmentally able yet to engage in that voluntarily. And so those stress chemicals do that, making us a little stronger, a little faster, a little more reactive quickly. And it shunts the control of our responses from what we call the prefrontal cortex, or this thinking part of our brain where we have learning and previous experience and access to things that we know, to a more primitive part of the brain. Because if you're going to survive, it wants you to react really quickly. And that primitive part of our brain does not have the ability to think and reason. It's reactive, and it has what we identify as survival responses. It changes how we function both physiologically and psychologically, and it reduces our ability to resist really basic survival impulses. We often, when we have stress chemicals in our body, experience what are identified as overt physical survival responses. And in our culture, we tend to talk about them as fight or flight. People tend to say people have the fight or flight response. And that is only part of the trauma triad that we typically see. Of course, if somebody is big enough and strong enough and capable of fighting off somebody who's sexually assaulting them, they're going to be less hurt. If somebody can run away and hide, they're also going to be less hurt. Children very rarely have access to those options because it's typically people, adults or older children, who have access to them and control over them and are responsible for them. So those are things that it's very rare that children engage in. The third response, which is entirely normal and happens to children and adults across the board, is called the freeze response. In some of the research literature, it's called tonic immobility, but it means that people have either an inability or a limited ability to act in their own behalf. Sometimes people literally feel frozen. I've heard people describe saying they wanted to scream and no sound would come out. They wanted to push someone away and their arms wouldn't move. Sometimes people have a limited ability to act, like to comply with an instruction an offender gives a child. But it's much more limited, and it really comes from that primitive part of our brain. It's a survival response. We think it's related to the way that when we were primary prey animals, which was only a few hundred years ago before we had weapons with very good aim, if you got attacked by a tiger or a bear and you played dead, you didn't move, sometimes they would become disinterested in you because some large prey animals don't like to eat things that are dead, or they really enjoy, you know, the fight with the prey. So we think that's where that comes from, but it's also protective sometimes because it allows people not to be engaging in ways that can cause offenders to use more force or more harm when they're assaulting someone. And with trauma, we develop brief but very vivid memories of things that remind us of the bad experience. Again, if you think about primitive responses, if you know what a bear smells like, you don't go too close to the bear den in the forest. If you know what color a tiger is, you stand very still when you see yellow through the trees. If you know what kind of chewing gum your father was chewing and you smell that smell, you may have a dump of stress chemicals again in your body to try to protect yourself. That's what we talk about when we're saying people have triggers. They get reactive to things that in childhood during the sexual abuse were scary. I've worked with people who opened a refrigerator and saw Dr. Pepper, and had a really horrible reaction and couldn't understand it, felt like they were going crazy, but their abuser always gave them Dr. Pepper as a treat after they were sexually abused. So we have these things that are reminders, mostly sensory in nature. They're either things we see or things that our senses experience, how we're touched, what we smell, what we hear. Sometimes they are those internal emotions that Dustin talked about, or emotional responses to things. So if we feel angry or overwhelmed, we may react like it's dangerous rather than just a conflictual situation with someone we can actually trust in adulthood. So those are things that when we talk about triggers, there are very real physical chemicals that dump into our system that stir up that trauma response again. And sometimes people, when they start the healing journey, even when they can recognize that they had a trauma response from a trigger, it may be very difficult to de-escalate that and kind of calm themselves again. Those are skills that you can learn and that develop over time, but initially it can feel like it takes a long time to pull yourself out of it, even if you know intellectually what's happening to you, and that can be very scary. And of course, for children who were repeatedly sexually abused, their stress response systems are often more sensitive and more reactive because they were in danger more often. So their stress response systems act like everything around them is dangerous. Then you get those trauma responses, which impact how you think and feel. And then your beliefs go that everything is dangerous. And when Dustin said earlier that all of these things are connected, he's so right about that. It's very powerful. There's a name even for what happens to children who are repeatedly sexually abused. I apologize, that was me, and I forgot to turn my phone off. I really apologize for that. When children are repeatedly sexually abused, researchers call that toxic stress because of the amount of stress chemicals that keep dumping into people's systems as children, and it can really impact how they learn to operate their stress response system, and it can be difficult for them to learn how to manage some of that stress response in adulthood, but it's possible and doable, and that's something I really want to keep encouraging people to understand. Even difficult responses are treatable and people can heal. It may take a long time, it may take finding the right help, but there are possibilities for getting better. I see in the chat that someone brought up that appease is identified as a fourth response. That is typically a behavior that is engaged in by children who learn to try to please their offenders or de-escalate their offenders. It is a little different than one of the primary stress responses that's directly connected to a chemical response in your body. It is more a learned behavior, but it often accompanies children's responses to trauma because, again, they have very little power. So one of the only ways they can kind of come through that is to try to appease or please, or some people talk about it, call it fawn. Some researchers talk about that as a fawning response, but those are typically learned behaviors that are really designed to help the child not get as hurt or not upset the offender more than they are tied to the physiological chemical trauma responses. So I think I've been talking for long enough, and I know that sometimes trauma can lead to more intense experiences of emotion like fear, guilt, or shame, but it's also possible for trauma to lead to people feeling numb or not feeling much or not feeling very connected to their bodies or to the world. Dustin, can you talk a little bit about how that's possible and what's happening when that's going on?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I'll kind of piggyback on the example that you gave, Gene, of this freeze response to stress. So if we imagine that we have that response in a moment where we're experiencing trauma, where we feel paralyzed or unable to move or control the situation, oftentimes, we're stuck to be in that situation. And so the only option then, in some ways, is to numb out of it, right? Or we might say dissociate out of it, meaning I need to reduce the intensity of this experience for my own survival. So I'm going to go someplace else mentally. Right? So it kind of starts with that piece, but then we add on the fact, right, that when children are experiencing sexual abuse that's out of their control and outside of their developmental capacity, they just can't handle the experience. Their brain has a really hard time processing and understanding and making sense of what happened. And the reality is that that sticks with us for a long time, right? Where we might still struggle to understand exactly what happened to us long after. So what we see is that that this can lead to feeling really out of touch with our body and our bodily sensations. Or we might even think that our body sensations are dangerous rather than just information, like Jean and I mentioned earlier, a sign of something we should pay attention to. So this can result in a failure to both care for our physical well-being or interfere with our ability to engage in positive, physically intimate relationships with other people. It's really talking about almost a fear of our body gets generated because of its connection to our past trauma that we've had, right? Which is an interesting way to think about it. But I also want to talk about what happens when disembodying or numbing becomes the way that we cope with our lives long term. Right? Because if I coped with my trauma by trying to dissociate out of it or pretend it wasn't happening or mentally go someplace else, there's a high likelihood that I try to cope with other stressful things in my life that way in the future. What we see here is that that when a pattern of coping in this way starts to happen, that it actually becomes your primary way of coping over time, where when stress happens, you are most likely to move towards numbing or dissociating from that stress. And there's a lot of ways to numb and dissociate from stress in the world that we live in now. Right? Maybe we're talking about overeating or eating when we feel like we really don't need to eat because it brings us some sort of positive feeling that we can be distracted from the stress by. Maybe we're talking about dissociating into television for long periods of time. Maybe we're talking about substance use. Or maybe we're just talking about zoning out and staring off into space when you're in the company of other people. So all of those things can be examples. Right? But unfortunately, distracting or numbing from experiences is only a short-term solution. So it is true, right, that if I'm experiencing high levels of stress and I binge watch TV tonight, I'll probably feel okay tonight. But the unfortunate consequence of using the strategy is that we discover that over time, as avoidance and numbing become our primary ways of coping, that we will actually experience more intense discomfort when we're not numbing. And this is where we get trapped, right? So I really want to be more present and deal and cope with my life in different ways. But anytime I don't dissociate, the level of distress I have is too much. And that's where some people in this room might find ourselves there. I know certainly at times I find myself, right, in that tendency to I kind of just want to default to numbing or distracting. That seems easier. To really have intentionality about thinking about the future and what that might do to all of us long term. Again, a very normal response to something like sexual abuse. Right? But at the same time, something that is a barrier or an obstacle to us long term getting over. And this speaks to what Jean had mentioned, right? That the reality of what we were capable of, what we had control of, what we had power over when we were a child is different than what we have power over now. We have much more power now. And we can use that power. And some of that power needs to be used towards, right, being more in our body and being more present with others. So, that's one aspect of the body, but I think one that's very implicated in sexual abuse is sexuality. So I'm wondering if Jean, if you wouldn't mind talking to us a little bit about sexuality and how trauma impacts that.
I'd be happy to do that. I think this is one of the things that can be sometimes most difficult to talk about or most frightening for people who've been sexually abused. And because we're exposed to sexual behaviors with adults or older children that are far outside the normal development of our sexuality. I mean, kids are doing things when they're little, like looking at each other or touching a little bit and not really even knowing what that means. And then you move into things like having your first kiss or your first boyfriend and holding hands, or your first girlfriend, or those kinds of, or fantasizing about having somebody be sexual with you. But children who are sexually abused are moved all the way through that continuum with no preparation, and really it's out of their control. There's no mutuality in that. So people can have their healthy sexual relationships as adults impacted, because they learn that sexuality isn't mutual for them as children. So sometimes that means that they confuse sex with love and may believe that people who have sex with them are people who love them. Whether or not that person has any care for them or is just doing a hookup on Tinder. Those things can really confuse people who have sexual abuse in their background. They also may end up basing a large amount of identity on their sexuality and on their capacity to attract sexual attention, because that's what they learned they were worth or good for when they were children. That is something that I think is really powerful. I've heard Marilyn talk about the fact, when she talks about the night child, that at least she got attention from her father at night. You know, she hated what was happening. She was completely dissociated from it during the day, but there was a part of her that understood it as attention from a man who didn't give her attention otherwise. There are also other things that can be harmed, in that sometimes when you are exposed to sexuality in an abusive relationship, you may end up saying it's the sex that was bad, not what the person did, not the violation that the person created by abusing a child, but the sex itself is bad. So some people end up avoiding or disliking sex, or not wanting to have intimacy even with people they care about, or sometimes even sabotaging that intimacy because it feels so confusing and difficult for people. So they can be a number of ways that sexuality is impacted, rather than finding ways to support healthy sexuality in adulthood, where there's real mutuality, where both people have a capacity to communicate what they want, what they like, to express caring and love that way, which can be a really powerful, wonderful part of life that can be damaged during childhood sexual abuse as well. And moving out of the discussion about body, we're moving into that discussion about spirit. And when we're talking about spirit, we're talking about how we interact with ourselves and the world, including our energy, our motivation to engage with the world, and our understanding of things that are larger than ourselves. Worldview, belief systems, those sorts of things. Our perception of our personal agency, our ability to act on our own behalf in the world, and our sense of voice. Do we have a right to speak what our needs are, speak up for ourselves, speak about what we believe, speak up on behalf of other people who've been oppressed? And do we have hopefulness for the future? Do we have the capacity to think about the future as something positive? And I'm relating back to some of the things people put in the chat about feeling like it's never going to be okay. I'm never going to be okay. I'm always going to be hurting. I'll never be able to heal. Those are all things that do what we call foreshorten your sense of future. They say the future is not something that I can look forward to with hope and with joy. It's something that's just going to be hard, or the same as things are now.
Well, what a huge category. A lot of great topics in here. Would you mind starting with relationships, Jean, and talking to us a little bit more about how those are affected?
Absolutely, I'd be happy to do that. I guess the first thing I want to say is childhood sexual abuse is a relational trauma. It is, it happens in the context of relationship with, it's one person harming a child. Sometimes it's more than one person harming a child, but it is in that relationship. And most of it happens in ongoing known relationships where there should be trust and a child should be able to feel safe and depend on the person. Now, there are some where it's someone who they don't know well or who are a stranger, still a person hurting a child. So it's always relational. But there's also the issue of breaking trust when it is someone you know. That is someone who should keep you safe, who should protect you from other people. And instead, they are using you to meet their own wants in a way that's harmful to you. And it often leads people to question the safety of others, to wonder if everybody's going to hurt you. Some people end up feeling detached from others for long periods of time. Some people end up in relationships where they do get hurt again as adults because they think that's all there is in the world. They expect that to be a part of what happens when you're close to someone. And some end up feeling like they don't belong or feeling different from others. Some really can't tolerate the discomfort of being close because it's a trigger for that fear that you had as a child or the harm you had as a child. So being close to somebody makes you pull back, withdraw, distance from people and push them away. It can be really, really difficult, and it can be connected to those beliefs that you're not worthy of love from other people, or that only other people deserve love, you don't. And in addition to that, particularly if you're dealing with this in adulthood, either you told someone and didn't get the support you needed, or you didn't tell anyone because there wasn't anyone to tell, or it didn't seem possible, or you were threatened not to, or you thought it was a normal part of growing up. But in either way, you had a distorted perception of what support is. You knew you didn't get it. And sometimes that makes you feel like you don't ever want to try to ask for it and you distance. Sometimes it leads to distorted beliefs that people who did get support got all of their needs met immediately by someone who could read their mind and tell exactly what they wanted. And children in normal, healthy families learn that they have to learn how to ask for what they want and need, and that sometimes the answer is no, and that people can still love them and they can still ultimately get most of their needs met. But if you never got your needs met and you have this perception that people should be able to read your mind and tell what you need if you were getting your needs met, which is something that young kids often have, because when you're really little, the only way of telling somebody you need something is to cry. And so people will often try to see if you're hungry, your diaper's wet, or you need a nap, because they're pretty basic needs that you have when you're really little. And so young kids tend to think that their parents can read their minds, which is not true. And it takes time in healthy families for kids to learn that they have to ask for things that are anything above the sort of basic level of food, sleep, and potty. So we really have to shift that around. But if you haven't learned how to do that, you may drive people away because you're mad at them because they don't know what your needs are automatically. Or you may withdraw when someone does try to meet the needs. And And you can fall into patterns that can end up causing conflict in a relationship or pushing people away or expecting too much of them without even being aware that you're doing it, because it seems so natural given where you came from and the abuse that happened to you. It can also be really difficult for loved ones who want to support you and care about you and sometimes don't understand your responses to them, which is why we think that loved ones all deserve to have access to support too during the healing journey, both so they understand what survivors need, but also so they're taking care of themselves in the process along the way. And I think one of the things I want to say is the other thing that we often do is we often confuse conflict with danger. And the reality is that in healthy relationships, conflict is how we solve problems. It's how we identify and solve problems. It's how we know that something needs to be addressed. It's how we tell one another what those things are and what we need. Sometimes we can do that without conflict, but often there's conflict involved. And when you grow up believing that any conflict is going to get you really seriously hurt, you may avoid conflict, or you may overreact to conflict and sort of try to win every fight, rather than learning that conflict can be a way for people to communicate their needs to one another and solve problems together. And it doesn't have to be dangerous or difficult. It can be healthy and helpful in the long run. And I think that's a really important piece of how people get stuck sometimes, is stuck in those fears that they have from childhood, and it keeps them stuck either repeating problems in relationships or avoiding relationships.
Great, I know that gave me a lot to think about, so thank you for going through that, Jean. I am wondering if we can talk a little bit about that future piece that you mentioned, and how survivors, or how we see generally survivors, might feel about the future or their future, and how that might be connected to whether they feel powerful in their lives and the abuse.
Okay. Yeah, this is one that I think feels very heavy, and it again is making me think of what came up in the chat, because it really does impact people's capacity to hope for the future. If an abuser is targeting a child and trying to gain trust and diminish the child's self-worth so they don't tell, you get rejecting responses from loved ones when abuse is disclosed, or when you are left with, as a child, feeling worthless or disempowered. Those things can all lead to us acting in that survival mode we talked about before. And survival mode is about acting in the moment to protect yourself from danger. You cannot expend energy focusing on the future and building what you want in your life over time when you are trying to survive what feels like life-threatening danger all the time. And this is an analogy that's not about childhood sexual abuse, but we see the difficulty when some soldiers come back from war because they've been every day in life and death situations that they needed to respond to immediately, and they have real trouble sort of readjusting to life in a normal world where they kind of get to plan and do things a little bit at a time, and they don't have to be reactive in every moment. Well, think about a child growing up in that, and growing up with those expectations. That can be really, really hard. So I think those things can be very, very difficult for people. Also, it limits people's sense of agency and their sense of voice, their capacity to speak up for themselves, to speak on their own behalf, to say what they need, to believe they're important enough to ask for what they need, and to ensure that they set good limits with people, and that they're living in spaces and working in spaces where they feel supported and cared for and are getting their needs met. So that can all be limited. People can feel silence. And we should remember that silence keeps the secret for the abuser. So it keeps the abuser safe, not the victim necessarily. But it feels like safety because you feel like it's dangerous to say what you need, because it was when you were a child. And, you know, another result of all of this, Dustin, is that I think many survivors feel kind of weighed down by life instead of energized by it. They feel like it's just heavy to get through, slogging through life. Can you talk a little bit about what's happening when that is going on?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I think about is if the world is a scary place, then why would I be excited to engage in it? And I think that that's probably the first thing that we're talking about is with all those beliefs and the reality of what's happened with childhood sexual abuse. I mean, it's hard to imagine how you could be excited after that. But one thing that I do want to really stress is that the reality outside of abuse is that living is actually a gift, right? That we're all given. And unfortunately, some of us have had the joy of that gift kind of ripped away from us or degraded by other people and the things that they've done. But I guess the unfortunate but also fortunate part is that really we have to engage in the world to receive the full benefits of it. If maybe we're talking about happiness, right? Or maybe we're just talking about comfort. But we really need to engage in the world to get those benefits. Even if we feel most comfortable at home or by ourselves, we may not actually be fulfilling all of our needs to be happy within that context. Once we understand how to keep ourselves safe and how to tell if others are safe, once we do that, then we need to push ourselves to really engage with others and the world more consistently if we're trying to create more of that energy for love. It's 100% going to be difficult. We may even experience pain, like emotional pain at times when we're trying to do this, but we will get better at it. And we will begin over time to appreciate things that right now may bring us discomfort or even terror. Right? But all of that starts with engaging in the world, which is maybe one of the most difficult things that we have to do, push through. And I think this one is really connected as well, Gene, to understanding of things that are bigger than ourselves. I think that energy for life, right, and this kind of bigger purpose or meanings oftentimes can be connected for people. And I'm sure you've seen this as well, but I've definitely seen that it can be hard to grapple with the idea that there is a bigger meaning behind our existence when the initial experience we have is of sexual abuse. It's hard to see a larger purpose in being hurt and abused. Like, how can there be a larger purpose to me being hurt or someone hurting me? And although I would reject, and Wings and Gene, we all reject the idea that sexual abuse is inevitable, meaning it had to happen. But we do think that there is a road towards healing that can lead towards fulfillment that many survivors may struggle to believe is actually possible. In that, we feel like there is space to consider a deeper purpose, what has happened. Some of us find purpose in exposing the abuses of power that our world has been built on and advocating for change. Some of us may find purpose in the connections that we create with other people, maybe many, maybe a few. Some of us may find purpose in providing our children with a safe, healthy childhood. And some of us find purpose in seeking a freedom that can only be found in someone who has experienced pain. No matter where you find yourself today, please know that you have a right to pursue your happiness, and there's a path for you, so long as you are willing to let down your walls a bit and aim for what you really need. And we hope that Wings and whatever support you have can also be there to help you accomplish that. It's a hard and long road, potentially, right? And certainly difficult to do on your own. I do want to take a moment to kind of destigmatize some of these effects that we've talked about. because, and Jean has mentioned this already, but all of the ways that our mind, body, and spirit respond to trauma are attempts to survive, right? They were based in a reality, a need to survive. The problem is that the behaviors and beliefs that we hold to survive generally become obstacles to us living when we are no longer experiencing life. When we're no longer experiencing life-threatening or psyche-threatening trauma. Notice there that we're talking about a difference between surviving and living. That those are two different things. For many survivors, it's inherent in the word. The goal has been to survive. There is a path towards living. Trauma can leave us in a state of defensiveness against the world, right? Us against everything else. As we mentioned, healing really requires us to embrace the world, or at least to embrace the safe part of the world, to distinguish what those are. So at this point, that's really all we want to say around the effects of trauma, childhood sexual abuse trauma. So we do want to open it up for a moment for questions. So we know people have been giving questions here and there, but if you have any specific questions about effects, we'll give a moment here to just consider some of those questions and answer. Let's see if we have any coming through. Okay.
Yes. This is a great question. We've got a question about effective strategies for recovery and resilience and post-traumatic growth, both of which are things we're going to be talking about in the next section. So I think it's probably good timing to move right there. What do you think, Dustin?
Yeah, I think that those are asking for exactly what we're going to talk about. So please hold on to those questions if we don't answer them and bring them back up to us at the end. But yeah, I think that's great, Jean. So why don't we move forward, and can you talk about, I guess, beginning the process of healing? Like, what does a survivor need to begin to approach the healing?
That's a great question, and I think it's one we get often. I think the first thing is to recognize that something's wrong, and be able to acknowledge that. And then to just acknowledge that the ways they've coped in the past have likely been based in a sense of survival and self-preservation. And while that was helpful and protective and necessary as a child, it may not be working any longer. And just be open to doing some things differently to be able to heal. And the first piece of that is understanding what the difference is between safety and danger, and that if we're safe in our adult lives, we're no longer in danger, and that even if we are in danger, we can learn how to be safe and keep ourselves safe. So because all of recovery from trauma starts with a perception of safety. And you'll notice that we have a reading and a beautiful picture about making a chrysalis for the changing human heart, that safety is a necessary condition for recovery. So when we're talking about safety, we mean actual physical safety in the world. It's real that some people may be in abusive situations or engaging in dangerous behavior, and we would deeply support and encourage people who are in those circumstances to seek out help from a domestic violence program or from a program that can help you with whatever dangerous behavior you're engaged in, because we really need you to be actually safe to start doing the recovery work, because otherwise you're going to have that survival stuff kicking up all the time, but it's going to be kicking up in response to real potential danger, which is important. We can make referrals if you don't know how to contact someone, so please feel comfortable to reach out to Wings, and we can help you with finding places to access safety if that's something that you need. So how do we start after we've established that first component of actual safety in our lives, Dustin?
Yeah, I would be happy to speak about that. So after we've ensured that we're in a safe place so that we can really focus on our healing, uh, that's when we're really going to move into a component that at Wings we like to refer to as speaking out. Now, for anyone who is connected to Wings, you might recognize that as the name of one of our specialty groups, but it's also how we really an element that we feel like is necessary in healing. So what I'm talking about there is that CSA trauma, especially, causes tendencies towards isolation and disconnection from others. Mm-hmm. We want everyone to know that we are at our weakest and most vulnerable when we are alone. As we connect and form community with safe people, our power and healing grows. And that's, in some ways, one of the most detrimental parts of trauma is that it leads to many of us moving away from each other when our strength and our happiness can be found in each other, right? Okay? So whether you seek support through therapy, support groups, friends, family, or online communities, we really encourage all survivors to start the process of healing by speaking to those that they trust. If you do not have someone you trust in your life, consider calling Wings and letting us help you locate a therapist that can help you test the waters of speaking out and begin your healing journey. Now, I mentioned the word trust, which is a huge word, especially when we're talking about trauma. So I really want to address this question of, what if I really find it difficult to trust other people? I would say that, one, if you're a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, that is accepted, that this would be difficult. The key, as far as I consider, is really not to judge ourselves for the difficulties we're having with trust and promote acceptance in ourselves. Because when we really think about it, our capacity to trust is inversely connected to our tendency to judge ourselves and other people. Right? Judging, evaluating, testing, they're all protective skills to help us predict safety. However, we need to accept that some of our judgments are more helpful to our happiness than others. Some may even prevent our happiness. The key is to determine which of the ways you evaluate others are necessary and which are unnecessary. Because we don't want to spend all of our energy evaluating others. Right? We want to spend most of our energy connecting to the people who are. So let's spend less time evaluating and more time connecting. So how do we do that, right? The only way that all of us can spend less time evaluating others is to understand what's the most important things to evaluate. So I want to talk about that for a moment as well. So how do we grow our capacity for trust? Well, we push ourselves to let go of the unnecessary ways we test others, and we hold on to those ways that are necessary. And we also need to leave room for the possibility that some ways that feel necessary today, we may find out later are not actually necessary. The idea is to predict if someone is safe, right? So once someone appears to be safe, we need to then choose to put our trust in them and accept. From there, we pay attention to signs that they may not be safe, but we mostly accept and trust. So what we're talking about, right, is, okay, I've tested this person, they seem safe. Now even if I'm feeling mistrusting, I need to try to accept and put trust. Well, right, in the background, I can pay attention to certain signs, but I need to try not to let those dominate my interactions with other people. And that's where a lot of this starts. So what are the tests that we should hold on to? So what are the tests that are important to consider or evaluate in other people? So maybe it's watching if other behaviors match what they say, right? So we would say, I can trust someone more whose behavior matches the words that they're saying. Okay? Maybe it's watching how people behave when they make a mistake or hurt you or someone else. Do they hide what they did? Do they blame others for what they did? Or do they take responsibility? Do they apologize? Do they change their behavior as a result? If you can answer that they did take responsibility, they did apologize, they did change their behavior, then those are signs of trust, right? That maybe trust is warranted. Also, watching for how they manage power. Right? Do they tend to spread power out to others and acknowledge others' contributions? Or do they tend to hold on to power or put others down? So these are the types of tests that we can hold on to and still use to try to assess safety. Then we have the tests that we need to let go of. Right? So these are the ones that maybe aren't as necessary, that maybe we still do. And these might be tests around expecting others to know what you need without voicing it. Maybe my loved one, I expect them to know what I need at all times without voicing it, and I have trouble accepting the opposite. And I feel like I can't trust them. But we would say that might not be trust we're talking about, or it might not be the loved one having the problem. Right? Maybe it's expecting others not to make mistakes or disappoint you. Or maybe even the confrontation that Jean was talking about. All of these can feel like rejection or that we can't trust, when really they're normal parts of relationships. And then I think the big one is expecting others to protect you. Right? Sure, we can trust people who are there to protect us and protect us, but we also need to remember that we can protect ourselves. And that we do not need someone to protect us in order to trust them. We need them to be there for us, right? To be connected, follow through with what they say they're going to do. We don't need them to protect us. And after we kind of decide all of those things, it's going to take a lot of deep breaths, a lot of giving ourselves some grace and others grace. We start building that capacity to trust others through this quite vulnerable process. Acceptance and patience is the key here with the process, but also with ourselves and with other people. So we're not turning a blind eye to danger, but we're trying to really identify what really shows danger and what just feels like it's showing. So I know we might have had some questions come up there. Let me read these here.
One of them says, it's hard to trust others when we can't trust ourselves. And that is a part of the journey, is learning to make those assessments, and learning to trust our capacity to make those assessments helps build trust for ourselves as well as for other people, which is very powerful.
I might be skipping one, but I want to answer this one. How do you learn to protect yourself? A very great question. So one, I think it starts with identifying what you really need protecting from. I think, right, really establishing that. Do I need protection from other people? Do I need what do I really need protection from? And is it something that's really dangerous to me now versus when I was being abused? Right? So I think it starts with that question. Okay. But then I think we're really talking about what sort of protection you're talking about. Are you talking about physical protection? Are we talking about emotional protection? Okay. Because physical protection, we may have more or less control of depending on the situation we're in. And we may choose to be careful about the situations we go in because of that. Or we may choose to learn some self-defense or other things, right, to feel safer physically. But I think a lot of times when I hear that word protection, I think of emotional protection. How do I protect myself from the emotions that other people make me feel, or the guilt or shame I feel forced to experience when I interact with other people? or they reject me. And those ones really, it comes down to practicing it a lot. Right? So how will I ever have confidence in protecting myself if I never try? Right? So I think that's the piece is we continue to try. We continue to explore the things that keep us safe. And we practice those in safe ways first. Right? So if I'm worried about protecting myself from the rejection of other people, I may not choose to start by going and speaking publicly in front of a huge group of people. Right? That may be putting myself in a position to be hurt. But I can practice those things in safe ways first and then move in. Right? We'll move into trying these things in more challenging situations where there is a more real threat, maybe you'd say, or real chance of experiencing those negatives. Do you have anything else you might say to that, Jean? Because I know I'm really focused on the emotional protection.
Well, I think that one of the things that we do that can be really helpful is when we connect with others in what we know are safe environments, like a therapist that we can trust, or a support group, or a good friend who's really been there for us, we can also ask questions about what they think about what's safe or not safe. I feel unsafe about this, or I feel like this person is violating my boundaries. Are they not? One of the things that I've learned over time is really to think about if I'm hearing something from one person, I can sort of take it or leave it. But if I check with more people that I trust or respect, and I hear the same thing, it often gives me a way to make judgments about that. Like, ask do you have a partner that's calling you names? My guess is that many of the people you trust would say, hey, that's not okay. You need to ask them to stop. And if they don't stop, then you need to look at that. Whereas if you say, my partner wants to talk about doing things I don't like to do and he likes to do, I think a lot of people would say, well, that's a reasonable discussion. Not that you have to do everything you don't want to do, but if you have different likes, maybe you negotiate each doing one thing new that's different. So I think that there are ways that we can use our support systems a little at a time to test things and to identify appropriate boundaries or appropriate safety kinds of concerns.
Yeah, thank you for that addition, Jean. I am noticing the time, and I noticed that we're pretty much at the end of our time, but we are just getting into our discussion of recovery. So what I do want to say here is that I think Jean and I are happy to stay and try to finish up some of this since we are recording it for other people. If people have questions that they want answered now, please add those. I know there are a couple more questions in the chat that we'll try to answer. So maybe, Jean, we can try to answer some of these last questions, and then we can move through. If attendees need to leave for whatever reason, please feel free to do that. And again, this will be recorded and you can come back and finish the content at any time. So one, I just want to apologize that it took so long. We had a feeling this could happen because there's just so many things to talk about. But we do want to make sure we provide everyone with this information on recovery. So if you do have to leave, please come back and watch the end of the video. Great. So were there any questions, Jean, that we missed that we wanted to answer?
I think we got most of them, but I'm going to have to go back up again.
See how the sign, something about the sign. So how can one react to those rather than ignore or justify them? I'm trying to think, understand this question exactly. I assume that the question is about emotional signs, or are we talking about the signs of whether we can trust them or not? So maybe if you could clarify that, I'd be happy to answer that.
And Dustin, I'm thinking the signs that may end up having negative responses. How does one react to those things? Like when you said, if someone is saying one thing and doing something different, or if they are not taking responsibility when you tell them that you don't feel good about what happened. I think it's very reasonable that that's a place where you start to test your own voice. And I think asking ahead of time about how do you tell someone that's not okay with me from a healthy adult place. I don't feel good about this. It felt really bad to me, and I don't like the fact that you're trying to say it was my fault because there wasn't something I did in this circumstance. I need to hear differently from you, or I'm going to have some different conditions about how we communicate or how we interact in the future. If it's someone you're living with, saying, this doesn't feel like a solved problem to me. Maybe we need some help thinking about going to couples counseling or marital therapy is a way to deal with that. Depends on the relationship. Certainly if it's a boss and you want to keep your job and you like your job, you may decide I'm going to have to be careful about how I interact or what I expect in terms of how this person uses power. But for now, this works for me. And you may want to think in that circumstance about if it gets to this kind of a circumstance, that's a thing I'm not willing to tolerate. So I may need to think about looking for another job. I think depending on the circumstance and the relationship, there are always ways to be able to say to someone reasonably, this is what I need. My feelings are reasonable here, and I've checked that out with others. And so I'm gonna continue to stand up for myself here. And you can do that without being really angry or being really reactive. You can do that in a way that is just clear and direct about what you need to do for yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Gina. I like the way that you said all that. It made me think about that if you have an expectation of someone, it really needs to be voiced at some point in any relationship, right? If we feel like that expectation isn't being met, because it may be the reality that the person doesn't know what your expectation of them is, or that by clarifying, right? Because it could be that the intention is not to hurt, but was just how the person was raised, right, or whatever. So we can make our expectations clear, right? But I do really appreciate what you're saying, Gene, about we really need to know ahead of time what our limits are, where our boundary is that we will not cross. We need to be able to voice that.
I think that's important.
Yeah.
So do we have anything else we need to focus on?
I just saw a question on how do we let go of fear, which is a huge question. So I think what I'm going to say for that one is that I think Gene's going to talk a little bit about a process that can help that as we talk through that. So maybe we can revisit that more there. But I will say that letting go of fear is a difficult process in terms of we really have to be open to tolerating more fear, to sitting with it more, and really getting a sense of what it means and exploring what the feelings inside of us really mean. And so I'm just going to say that, but then hopefully we can address it a little bit more as we go.
Okay, Dustin. And I just realized we got another question from Cecile that said her therapist focuses almost entirely on somatic therapy, reducing the nervous system overload. And she thinks a more complex approach would work better for her. And we're going to talk some about this. And there are, as we go through the next bit of information, and there are reasons to start with being able to contain that nervous system overload and regulate those trauma responses, because until you can regulate those, it's much more difficult to engage in the other parts of healing. And I think it's reasonable to ask your therapist about when you might incorporate some other pieces. But you can listen through what we have next, and if we don't respond to that well enough, please ask more specific questions, because I think that's a good question. Starting is an essential part of recovery, but so it's an trust is really an ongoing part of that journey. So, Dustin, you have a great way, I think, that you talk about what recovery from childhood sexual abuse looks like for an adult, which is a little different than somebody that's dealing with a recent trauma. And so I'd really appreciate it if you could share that with us.
Yeah, absolutely. So the most important thing I want to establish is that recovery really starts with discovering that you have an injury from abuse and challenging any beliefs that you may have to suggest that you're the problem or that you're inherently broken or bad or whatever it might be. Okay? So I like to use this example of a physical injury to help create a little bit more acceptance of this. Hopefully this is something that will resonate with some. So you want to just take a moment and try to imagine the scenario as I'm going through it. Consider that as a baby, you dislocate your shoulder. Tell your parents, but they tell you that you're fine and need to suck it up. You grow up through your childhood thinking it is normal to experience constant discomfort and pain, thinking that there is something inherently wrong with you that makes it so you can't do the things other kids can with their shoulder. You get older, you go to the doctor, but by this time your shoulder has fused together and it seems to the doctors that you have permanent damage to your shoulder that cannot be fixed. Then one day you convince yourself to get another opinion. This doctor hears what you said and examines your shoulder. The doctor tells you that it seems like it could have been an injury from childhood that was never fixed. The doctor tells you that they can fix your shoulder, but they will have to re-injure it to put it back in place. The doctor tells you this may lead to more intense pain and discomfort initially, but will eventually resolve the issue you have been experiencing. You eventually agree. The doctor breaks your shoulder to put it back in place. You have less mobility and more pain for a few months. Then you discover that your shoulder starts to feel better. You start to be able to do more things with it than you could before. And you finally accept that what you were told as a child was not true. You finally accept that you have power others never let you see when you were a child, and that you can take action to improve your circumstances. It may be more painful at first, and it takes a lot of trust that what people like Jean and I say is true. We hope all survivors can give themselves the chance to experience the same healing outcome for their trauma injury as they would for a physical one. We can survive with an injury, but we can't thrive until we heal our injury. We cannot truly live until we heal our injury. And we absolutely believe that healing from trauma is similar to this circumstance. That everything that we were told and experienced as a child tells us that we are permanently damaged, when in reality, we've just not known the way to heal. Or haven't been connected to the people that can help us heal, right? The right people. So, as we talk about that, I think a natural question that comes up for people is, so how long does this whole healing thing take then? Right? Because how long is this all going to happen? So what I will say is that healing from an injury depends on the extent of the injury, right? How much I injure my arm will determine how long it takes to heal. So the extent of your injury matters. So how long you've lived with the injury without help matters. How intentional, diligent you are in your recovery matters. So I think about this question here. Are you someone who metaphorically walks on your injured foot even after the doctor says not to? Are you someone that likes to push things in maybe a not so helpful way? I think we all can think of sometimes we've done that to ourselves. Right? And healing really requires us to be intentional about not doing those things. But we also know that we will have backslides at times in recovery. So many people do not start being intentional about their healing until later in life, for a lot of the reasons we've talked about not really being aware of what's happening or not knowing how to go about it. So for those people, the healing journey can be quite long. However, once we become intentional about our healing, we tend to find that there's several years that can be tough in the healing process that follow, but that after that, we tend to see people hit, I guess what I would describe as an area of growth that requires a little less active participation, or it feels a little less distressing and intense all the time. And we might see time, after that, this kind of period of mostly stability where we fall down at times, right? Or things hit us that we didn't realize would affect us so much that we need to work on, right? So we do see that healing is an ongoing process, but we do not see it as something that has to be full of intense discomfort and emotional pain forever. And so we think that's important. No, is that it might feel like forever at times, but once we can become intentional about how we're approaching our healing, it does not have to last forever, that pain that we're. So I hope that analogy was helpful to people, and I really want us to move from this kind of idea of recovery to this question that we had received earlier about resilience. So Jean, could you talk to us a little bit about that, and maybe some of the changes that someone would experience as they heal from CSA trauma?
Absolutely. And I think the really important thing I want to talk about here is what we know about resilience and post-traumatic growth. And we have a visual for this one that I think is really powerful, that we know that trauma causes injury and harm to people. And all of those impacts we talked about to mind, body, and spirit. But one of the things we know from really good research across all kinds of trauma is that there is something called post-traumatic growth. There is resilience and the capacity to recover in a way that actually makes people stronger and more resilient, better able to bounce back from difficulty than people who've never experienced serious trauma. So that is one of the silver linings in having trauma, that if we are intentional in our recovery process, if we really work through what we need to learn, we end up with greater strength and greater resiliency than people who have had lives where they didn't experience trauma. And I think that is powerful because it really does mean we're in charge of how our lives go in the long run. And it may take some time to figure out how to do that, but it also is really possible to have full, rich, wonderful lives that feel good to us. And I think that's something that's really important. The other thing is resilience isn't something you're just born with. We all have certain coping abilities that we're born with, but resilience is literally a set of skills that you can learn to manage stressors, to handle difficulties, to think about yourself, others, and the world with a consistent intention to use them. So you are in charge ultimately of whether you get to develop that resiliency and post-traumatic growth or not. And I think that's incredibly powerful and hopeful way to look at all of this. And I'm going to take a little while and talk about the process of recovery incorporates the following kinds of changes. Now, different people focus on different things. Different people learn different things more quickly than others. Some people bump up against other challenges that make recovery more difficult. But the reality is, when somebody's fully recovered from trauma in a way that we call integrating and doing post-traumatic growth, these are the changes we expect to see in their behavior and functioning. So the first is that people actually are capable of intentionally de-escalating that physiological trauma response when they're not in danger. So that means they learn how to tell the difference between safety and danger, both physical and emotional, and they learn how to not act out of a trauma-based response unless they're in immediate physical danger, which is when it's really protective. So that's something that is kind of a baseline skill, that we stop operating out of that survival physical response that creates the mentality and the belief systems that keep us kind of, I think you said earlier, Dustin, handcuffed by our early childhood sexual abuse. Then what happens is that the cognitive part of our brain, where we have learning, previous experience, the capacity to assess and make good decisions based on that learning and previous experience, is what's in charge of your responses and available to you in the here and now. This really amazing trauma researcher, Bessel van der Kolk, said, trauma is a disorder of the here and now. People continue to act as if they are in the past, in the trauma, instead of responding effectively to what's happening in the here and now. So we want that ability to stop having the trauma response so we have access to all of our brain to be able to help us recover. And then we will learn the ability to tolerate real feelings about things, both good and bad, in ways that don't overwhelm us so much that we turn into a puddle, or we get terrified, or we withdraw, or we shut down and distance and numb. Because those are trauma responses. Those overwhelming anxiety, fear, and distress, and the dissociation are both responses grown out of trauma. We should be able to feel really intense feelings without being overwhelmed and without having to numb or shut down. An example for me in my current life is I responded extensively to the Columbine High School shootings. I never go by an April 20th without being very aware of that's what happened on that day. And now what I do is I feel that sadness, and I also feel the real profound love and respect I have for the colleagues that I worked with in responding to that. And I reach out to them every year. So it's strong emotion, but it is not based in trauma any longer, which is really powerful. So then the next skill that we expect to see is that you begin to experience the trauma as something that's past, that's part of your history, that you remember, that isn't present in your current day life and overwhelming all the time. That you can intentionally, for periods of time, put aside that traumatic experience and engage in the here and now as a person who lives in the here and now, not as a person who feels damaged by the past and like something is horribly wrong with them. But you can, you know, you may have those feelings periodically, but you begin to engage more and more as someone who has a history of trauma, but who's not living in trauma. And then one of the most important components, and in all the research, the most important component is that you continue or reestablish social support, and that you ultimately use that social support network to feel connected to others in the world. And what we expect to see is that you start healing. You may have a smaller network of people you begin to test trusting with, but as you really learn how to use that social support and learn what the difference between somebody who's trustworthy and somebody who's not is, that you then can expand your social support network and really feel engaged with the world, not just in one tiny area, but in multiple different ways, with friendships, maybe with intimate relationships or family, with colleagues, and that you feel more connected. We know that social support is the single most effective component of people who develop resilience post-trauma, is that they have a social support network and that they learn to use it regularly. Some of us have them and we very rarely reach out, but learning to reach out more often and stay connected is so important. then you begin to, as a part of this process, identify your own feelings and needs. You begin to be able to speak up for yourself, first in smaller, safer ways, and then in your life as a normal part of your life. You feel like you're taking effective action. You feel like you are thinking and planning for your future in a way that you might not have done for a very long time, or maybe not ever before. And then ultimately, this will lead to your identity as a survivor becoming a component of your life rather than the primary component. When Dustin was talking about sometimes there are some really hard periods of time, for some people years, for some people months, where they really feel like what they're doing is working on being a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, and it takes up a lot of attention, energy, and effort. As you move through the healing process, it becomes one of the things you are, not the primary thing you are. It's a part of your history. It's a part of who you are in the here and now because you have engaged in recovery and healing. But it doesn't take up as much room in your life, and you have room for the other parts of you to develop and flourish in different ways. And then the final component when we look at the process of healing is the development of transformational meaning about your experience of sexual abuse. And I thought Dustin did a beautiful job earlier of talking about, for some people, that means I'm available to other survivors and I work on dealing with this, or I work on legislation to help survivors who've been through this, or I become someone who speaks up about this in my social circle or my church or my wherever I work. Sometimes it really is, I'm committed to providing a safe environment for my children because I understand how awful unsafe environments can be. So I think there are lots of ways you can do that, have that development of transformational meaning about that experience. And as you do that, you develop more and more resilience, because having connectedness in the here and now, engaging in the present, feeling connected to things you're working on or doing, negotiate hard times when they happen. And you practice self-care regularly, not because somebody is telling you that that's a part of your homework from group or therapy, but because it feels good to do it and it's the right thing to do, and it's creating intention, making attempts to change things, doing an assessment of how it felt, what was that like, notice what worked and what didn't work, and then do it over again and over again and over again with different things until it starts to be a part of who you are, and then you can work on something else. And celebrate that. Part of resilience is acknowledging and celebrating what you have done to get through this. And I think that's such an important component of developing resilience and recovery. And we certainly can take any questions if there are any left.
Yeah, thank you for going through all of that, Jean. We'll see if any questions come up. We do want to honor the time everyone's made, and I think cut this to an end here as quickly as we can for people. So let's see if any other questions come up that we can answer, and hopefully we can get everyone out of here by 6 in a couple of minutes, if possible.
Okay. I am not seeing, are you? Oh, here we go. Ah, this is a wonderful question. Feeling good, starting to feel better can feel strange and uncomfortable and like something's wrong. And that's a part of that sort of testing and giving yourself grace and being able to say out loud to yourself, this feels good and it feels strange. And if I want to like run away from it and feel bad again, maybe I need to reach out for some support for somebody to encourage me to sit with the uncomfortable good feeling. I think that's a part of the keep approaching it, keep letting yourself have it, keep noticing when you want to run from it, and really allow yourself to be supported in that process. Because I think it is easy to say the pain feels normal. And when you go back into the pain, notice that, don't beat yourself up, and decide, okay, I'm going to try again. Maybe I need more support when I move forward this time, or maybe I need to take a smaller step this time and sit with that before I move on. But it's that process of moving and a little bit of falling back and a little bit of moving more, and using our support to hold us and cradle us as we do move.
Well, so I get we do have a couple of other questions in here. So we might be able to answer maybe one more of them before we end. I do want to just take a moment and let everyone know who's still with us that if you have questions for us that we couldn't answer, please email us. Our email address, Julia just posted in the chat. We are more than happy to answer any questions anytime about this or any other topic, so around CSA and trauma. So please let us know if you have further questions that we couldn't answer. We apologize that it went long, so we're not able to do that as well. So, yeah.
Perfect. I'm just going to say a quote that makes me think of what healing is like. It's very brief. It's from Leonard Cohen, and he says, so ring the bell that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. Thank you all for spending so much time with us, and thank you for taking the risk to ask questions and share information. We really appreciate that.
We really do.
And thank you to our interpreters too for staying with us throughout our extended presentation.
Well, thank you everyone, and please take care and be safe.